Good afternoon, good morning in the United States. I'm Harold James from Princeton. It's a great pleasure to introduce this week's version of the International Macro History Online Seminar Series, the series that's hosted fundamentally from Geneva, where Emma Rothschild, professor at Harvard, is going to speak about her new article. Emma's obviously very, very well known and distinguished, and has a unique voice in economic and financial history. She's written really substantial books on economic sentiments, Adam Smith, Condorcet, and the Enlightenment, 2001, then The Inner Life of Empires, 2011, and recently An Infinite History, fascinating family history that sprawls out from France, goes over centuries, from Princeton University Press this year. She's written a number of articles in the journal that's edited by Marc Flandreau and Caroline Biltoft, Capitalism, including economic history and nationalism. But today she's going to present her really, really wonderful paper, Where is Capital? That appeared in the most recent issue, the summer 2021 issue of Capitalism. So Emma, over to you. And I'm sorry, before we begin, the rules of the game, that the questions should be put in the Q&A, not in any chat. And there's a mechanism for also voting up questions according to their importance. So we'll start with the questions then after the initial presentation, and run for an hour, and then move to an informal session for another 15 minutes. Thank you, Emma.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Harold, for the generous introduction. And it's wonderful to be here. And the Joint Centre for History and Economics is part of the large consortium that has something to do with this seminar. So this paper is really a list of things to do, or things that I wish I had done or might someday do. The paper that was circulated was published this past summer. It's extremely long, and my impression is that, with the exception of our kind-hearted moderator and one or two others in his proximate vicinity, it has not been widely read. So I think I'll start with a few words of background. The paper was inspired by three recent tendencies in economics, all of them fairly remote, at least at first sight, from economic history. But one thing all the approaches have in common is an interest in information and an assumption, implicit or explicit, that information is essentially infinite, if only one takes the trouble to find it. The thought experiment in the paper consists in imagining that there is, in fact, infinite information about an historical period, in this case, the period of the early Industrial Revolution, primarily in Britain and France, and in trying to think about what an economic history of the period would be like in these circumstances. I call this in the paper a Martian experiment. This is the slide, after the biologist Jacques Monod's description in Chance and Necessity of an imagined Martian NASA landing in France and trying to decide which of the things they observed were natural and which were made by human beings. And the idea is that one might be thinking about the multitude of information available about a historical period and thinking which of the things were economic. The method in the paper, to the extent that there is one, consists of exploring the ways in which the eclectic histories of economic life that have flourished over the past decades, histories of economic thought, high and low, legal histories of economic exchanges, and so forth, can help to identify data and episodes that can be helpful in relation to some of the largest questions with which economists, economic historians have been concerned. And if I just permit myself one sort of word of ego-histoire, Harold very kindly mentioned a couple of the, or several of the recent books I've written. I did stop trying to be an empirical economist, or at least someone publishing in a form of economics about 30 or more years ago. But over the intervening years, I've sort of thought I was trying to think about economic history in exploring a lot of micro-historical or intellectual historical topics. And I suppose the paper is in part about trying to put some of those observations together. So the 3 points of departure in recent economic thought. The first is work by the late Emmanuel Fahy and David Baquet on the micro foundations of macroeconomics, on the possibilities of economic as distinct from statistical aggregation, and on understanding the behavior of economic aggregates from below, quoting them, macro as explicitly aggregated micro. The second is the microeconomics of development, with its openness to, quote, many types of evidence, qualitative and quantitative, and its optimism about finding new sources of information in natural experiments, randomized trials, and almost everywhere else. And the quote about many kinds of evidence is from Banerjee and Duflo. The third, and in some ways the least prominent, is the unduly least prominent, is the cumulative transformation of the measurement of national output and the integration into these measurements of information about inter-industrial flows, of which the outcome has been a profound change, as will be seen in the depiction of capital. And there I'm thinking about something not particularly widely used among general economists, the Clem system, for which Dale Jorgensen was one of the founders. So in the paper, I take a simple accounting identity, in this case, the Clem's identity, as the framework for the agenda or the list of things that historians might explore. And most of the paper is an examination of possible sources for historical inquiry in relation to K, L, E, M, and S. Some further clarifications. The paper, at least until the conclusion, is very conventional in that it follows the US national accounts delineation of the economic in its initial iteration of 1934, with which Simon Kuznets was associated. I quote, efforts whose results appear on the marketplace of our economy, roughly the production boundary in contemporary accounts. And this matters, of course, in relation to things like environmental costs and how to cope with unpaid labor. Then I try to think about historical data in terms of GNP rather than GDP. This is very old-fashioned, as people know. Almost all the classic series of long-term growth accounting are concerned with GDP or GDP per capita, but GNP and GDP differ in ways that may be of importance in relation to the evaluation of 18th and early 19th century economic change. These are the sorts of things that are super boring to economists, and the late great Tony Atkinson always used to regret that that undergraduate students in economics didn't have to spend months and months and months studying this sort of thing. Both GNP and GDP are measures of the economic activity of a nation in a particular period. Both depend on concepts that are not uncomplicated: residence, location, attribution, and that were also, in fact, the subject of intense discussion in 18th century Europe. In the thought experiment, I tried to explore a GNP-like concept of production. I'm also concerned with gross output in a different sense. GNP and GDP are identified as gross because they don't make allowance for the depreciation of assets like materials, like machinery, over the course of a particular period. X in this framework is different. It is gross output and in a distinct and in many ways more intuitive sense. It is the value of everything that's produced in a nation over the course of a year, and it's equal to the sum of everything that's spent in the course of production on labor, capital, energy, materials, and purchased services. Now, gross output is seen as a measure of economic life that is business-centered, even vaguely Austrian, and that identifies businesses rather than government or consumers or welfare as the principal object of economic inquiry. But that, in a way, is the point. It is much larger than GDP, about 1.75 times as large in the US in 2020, because it includes flows of goods and services that don't count in national accounts. These are the things that are defined as having been used up in the process of production, intermediate inputs. They vanish in a material or an economic sense. So intermediate inputs are central to the paper and the agenda for historical inquiry. And I should say too that one additional source in recent economic thought is work that takes capital somewhat less than respectfully in thinking about economic change. Capital and as distinct from intermediate inputs. Charles Jones from Stanford is a great figure here, incorporating intermediate goods into our models has a first order impact on how we think about economic development. Intermediate goods are just another form of capital. Their invisibility may prove to be an ill-advised admission. And then a large number of recent economists writing about capital and intermediate goods. So I'm trying to reflect this perception in thinking about historical sources. So to the inputs. What I want to do is simply point to some questions that seem to me to arise in relation to each of the K, L, E, M, and S inputs. On capital, I mention only capital inputs. I've mentioned only 2 points from the paper. The first has to do with the possibly very large share of repairs and maintenance in overall inputs of capital in a world of wooden machines, many of them produced within landed or wooded estates. And this is a point made by Sidney Pollard many years ago. The second point I make about capital is connected to the GDP distinction. This goes to the larger context of the enterprise in a way. The enslaved in the British or French colonies were included sometimes explicitly, as in the famous Colquhoun estimates of wealth from 1814 in, quote, productive private property. They were also, in many cases, property, in this case, capital, supplied by residents of the metropolis or the hexagon, using the language of contemporary accounts. And this is from a legal case that I actually talk about in my book on empires. Patrick Colquhoun, about whom he's known as a statistician, I talk about him a bit in the paper, he estimated the capital value of the enslaved in what he described as the British and the conquered West India colonies in 1814 at 55 million pounds. This is the second column from the left. And this is by far the most famous estimate of capital that was produced during the Industrial Revolution period. It was widely used by growth accountants until the 1970s, really. So these are the British colonies, and these at the time, also the second column from the left, were the conquered colonies. Many of them reverted to France and Holland. So 55 million pounds, and just to give some perspective, Colquhoun estimated the total value of what he called steam engines and other expensive machinery at 60 million pounds. So this was the enslaved in contemporary accounting were a pretty significant part of overall wealth. Then just a couple of points about labor inputs. I do draw on outstanding work about the employment of women. I also try to raise the question of large, if fluctuating, employment in the military, particularly in France, and employment in transport and construction. These are areas where contemporary statistics are extremely sparse, and where our thought experiment would be wonderful. The work of the enslaved, I should add, was a flow from capital, not labor, in Colquhoun's contemporary accounting scheme. Sorry. But I do note in this section of the article the scale of movements of individuals in the late 18th century. And I take the case of the tiny island of Grenada and more generally. And the scale is really quite striking. I give statistics for the employed population of Glasgow and Manchester, comparing it to the number of enslaved people who were disembarked in British vessels in this tiny island, a bit smaller than Glasgow. The numbers are really very large for Jamaica and Saint-Domingue. So I talk about this a bit just to convey that there ought to be better ways of thinking about how this aspect of the colonial economy fits into the story we try to tell about the Industrial Revolution. Moving on energy, all I really want to do today is to emphasize what seem to me to be the extraordinary possibilities for cooperation between economists, economic historians, and environmental historians, following classic work by Tony Wrigley and more recently by Paul Ward. In the paper, I did raise one possible line of inquiry, again in relation to the colonial economy of slavery, namely that inputs in the form of what would now be considered green or renewable energy, and in particular improvements in the technology of using wind and solar radiation, might be of interest in such an investigation. This is a wind map, a map of shipping in June 1790 from Ben Schmidt, and this is a contemporary depiction of solar radiation. It's material inputs that are really at the center of the project. In contemporary US national accounts, it is, quote, transactions involving structures and equipment of types that are not normally depreciated over more than 1 year that count as sales of intermediate inputs. The commodity composition of the inputs in modern times is surprising. In fact, semiconductors loom very large in materials inputs. The intermediate inputs that are classified as materials. In the early industrial period, as this won't be a surprise, the materials inputs were, as one might say, much more material. In the paper, I emphasize Adam Smith's preoccupation with what he called the materials of manufacture. And this is rather implausibly a direct quotation from The Wealth of Nations. And you can see why some contemporaries thought it was an exasperatingly empirical book. What I suggest in the paper is, I quote, an economic history that takes intermediate inputs seriously. And I suggest that this could take the form of a sequence of micro-histories of obscure industries. Now, it will be clear to people there are two ways in which the importance of intermediate inputs could have increased, or at least could have increased over the period of the long industrial revolution, through an increase in the value of the inputs and an increase in their factor productivity, a secondary factor productivity. And there is some evidence of both. In the paper, I talk about Paul Ward's work on the alkali potash, very dramatic findings about the increase in use, and about what Ward describes as an ecologically minded input-output model of early industrial development. This is what potash actually looks like, and it's what all those Russian, Polish, and Baltic forests were reduced to in the late 18th century. I also talk a lot about alum, or sulfate of aluminum and potassium, which was a mordant, a biting substance, essential for fixing colors in the textile industry, and described by an eminent French historian of the 1960s as, quote, the greatest indicator of industrial activity ever calculated from the end of the 15th to the beginning of the 19th century. Now, alum was the subject of intense interest and indeed speculation around the time of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. The production of alum, too, had extensive and often local environmental effects. This is the famous burning mountain in the Saar, visited by Goethe in a famous passage from his autobiography, described in a famous passage in his autobiography. And still, I discovered when I was trying to make this PowerPoint last night, burning today. This is a recent photograph. I could go on about almost throughout Adam Smith's entire list of things that would be fascinating to study. There are, as people know, remarkable recent studies of innovation in the uses of copper, and the excellent recent study of maritime safety by Kelly, Mokia, and Ograda is an evocative journey into M-type inputs like nails and knees and copper sheathing, and also into intermediate inputs of the services of financial and insurance intermediaries. I suggest in the paper that to take intermediate input seriously can be of interest in relation to several large or macro questions, including the role of the military state in the economic revolutions of the 1750s to the 1810s. But technical change also unfolded to a considerable extent within combinations of intermediate inputs, as Smith's slightly incantatory lists suggest. To take intermediate input seriously can also suggest ways of connecting micro inquiries to a different macro question, as my comments on Ward's work suggest, about the Industrial Revolution and the natural environment. Materials that are used up in the process of production did not vanish without a trace. They became residues or raw materials again. But even more generally, the Clems-inspired accounting identity and the inquiry into gross output can, I think, suggest ways of evaluating linkages or multipliers throughout the economy. In contemporary terms, this would be an exploration of the contribution of, quote, changing input combinations to productivity growth. This is Daron Acemoglu's expression, using not exactly input-output data, because I have no illusion that these can be derived for our period, but an input-output or Leontiev way of thinking, a framework. So the last of the inputs, S, or purchased services, is at first sight the least evocative in a thought experiment in 18th century history. The expansion of value added in services has indeed been the principal stylized fact of the late modern economic growth of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But it is evident, in spite of these stylized facts, that a substantial part of the population of late 18th century in Britain and France was employed in the production of services, as work by the Cambridge Group has shown, a very significant part in any vista of economic life that included the labor of female and male domestic servants, the employees of religious institutions, and the government employees, including the armed forces, who were excluded from the major inquiries of the times and who are, in modern accounts, part of the service sector, but not the service producing sector. Now, most of the output of these industries was destined for the equivalent of final demand. That is to say, it was sold to or used by households and governments. It was not, with one important exception, sold to other industries in the form of S inputs. The exception was the service producing industry that has been so prominent in late modern growth, which is finance, insurance, and credit. There are two large and incipiently heroic narratives about economic growth now as in 18th century Europe. One is a story about the real or industrial economy, and the other is a story of financial revolution or financial innovation. The two histories are, for the most part, as so often in economic thought, parallel rather than integrated. They have in common a narrative of change in institutions and an explanatory variable or elixir in the security of property rights. There was investment and ingenuity, and there was also an expansion of public credit in England and of notarial credit in France. Now, the expansion in inputs with which we've been concerned in the journey through K, E, M, and even L required credit at almost every stage. The expanding networks of credit required the activities of writers in the sense of solicitors and writers in the sense of copyists, as well as factors, agents, brokers, translators, clerks, and messengers. The archaic technology of financial information was itself news, and it is plausible that at least some of these activities should be counted in our thought experiment as intermediate inputs in the form of purchase services. The messengers and solicitors, or some of them, were employed by partnerships that sold their services to intermediate use. These were uses in which technical change was embodied, or at least the technology of receiving market information a few hours ahead of everyone else, in much the same way as the technologies of the organic chemical industry were embodied in inputs of potash, or today the technologies of the electronics industry in inputs of semiconductors. One of the conventional explanations for the resilience of the recent US economy, the new quote unquote new age of markets, was the combined effect of information technology and financial technology, particularly securitization. Finance was identified as an information-intensive business, and one which had the effect of expanding both the supply of credit and the efficiency with which resources, especially capital, will flow to their highest return use. These are quotations from my colleague, friend Larry Summers. Intermediate inputs of financial services in this historical inquiry could even be the equivalent of the explanatory variables of macro history, like literacy or skill supply, or like semiconductors in our own times, with respect to increases in efficiency or total factor productivity. The disconcerting possibility is that something like the hypothesis of efficient allocation was true of the British economy in the late 18th century, and that the highest return users to whom so much capital flowed were the entrepreneurs of slave-dependent commerce and production. The financing of ventures in the slave economy, together with war finance, was of importance to financial innovation from the Asiento to the Napoleonic Wars. As a student of Adam Smith argued in support of this 1772 legislation, proprietors in the West Indies could not borrow money at less than 8%, while foreigners were prepared to lend at 5%, quote, where the security is unexceptionable. What objection then to providing them with security or securitization by enabling them to recover their money through the sale of mortgaged events? Had we all the money in Europe at a reasonable interest, we should be the bankers of Europe. So those are my episodic thoughts on K, L, E, M, and S, and I'll just conclude by saying that I think the with one optimistic suggestion, which is that, returning to the larger questions of method, good or modern or mainstream economics, I think, can be complementary to good or modern or mainstream history. And there is a possibility even of exchanges that go beyond the sort of interdisciplinarity in which everybody, as in Condorcet's expression of 1793, is consecutively boring and bored. The map of the micro and the macro of economics map only imperfectly onto the micro and the macro of history. But history, as much as economics, is living with a new abundance of information or evidence. The information is not new, but the ways of finding it and using it have changed beyond recognition. The inquiries by historians that I refer to in the essay have been based on prodigious ingenuity in using old sources and in thinking about sources in different ways. The critique of statistical and archival sources, which is so central to historical inquiry, is also essential for economics amidst the new ocean of information. I'm certain, most of all, that the inquiry is important. To see the macro from below or from the ground up is to see different disconcerting sorts of evidence. The eclectic inquiries of the past generation into the history of economic life, with their multiplicity of sources, have changed, for example, the understanding of the institution of serfdom on the basis of estate records and of early modern credit on the basis of high and low economic writings. An inquiry into the varieties of capital in the Industrial Revolution, so profoundly, disorientingly different from our own, is also of macro importance. This was not a time when nothing happened, even if the end of what began then is the unidyllic world in which we now live. And I think I'll finish, since I am drawing on what a lot of the economics, in a way, of the right, with a wonderful quotation by Ronald Coase about theory and insight and where inspiration comes from. My own feeling is that the inspiration is most likely to come through the stimulus provided by the patterns, puzzles, and anomalies revealed by the systematic gathering of data, particularly when the prime need is to break our existing habits of thought. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Emma. That was just wonderful. I don't see any questions at the moment, but that gives me an opportunity, I think, to ask you something that was on my mind when I read the wonderful paper in Capitalism. The power of this is the attention to particularities and to the micro story, and you make that point very, very powerfully and very effectively. I wonder how much the result would look different if you would have completely alternate historical epoch as the basis for the data expedition. And so you could think, for instance, when you had the slide about alum manufacture, I was triggered into thinking about the late Middle Ages and the papal alum manufacture and the centrality of that for the network of bills of exchange through Europe. But I thought if you would take the late Middle Ages or the early Renaissance, or alternatively take some span in the 20th century, how would the results look different to the ones that you're presenting for the period of the classic industrial revolution? In other words, what's particular to this old concept of the classical industrial revolution in your presentation today, and what would be similar if we just went into a completely different period?
Well, thank you for that. I mean, to the extent that I have an ambitious view about what I'm saying in this paper from the point of view of method, namely that trying to do aggregation of micro histories into macro, it's completely general. I mean, I thought a great deal about the late medieval, early modern period, and it's interesting you mentioned the papal production of alum. The eminent historian I quoted was actually Jean de Lumeau, who was later known as one of the great historians of Catholicism, but whose first work was an absolutely wonderful study on the papal alum mines in Tolfa. And part of the reason that alum has not been thought about too much was that the two really important mines were in Anatolia, a remote part of Anatolia, and in the Papal States, which are not parts of the continent of Europe that are thought of as sort of key sites for industrial innovation in the early modern periods. I think that's one reason why the alum story has been missed. But of course, I draw on Francesca Trivellato's work. I draw on Sheila Ogilvy's work. I mean, this is very much inspired by early work in the early mid-modern period. I think the question of what this would look like for 20th century, sort of a mid-20th century period is really fascinating, because of course one then has much more information. One does, starting in the mid-20th century, have actual input-output data. So to some extent, I think I am going back to the Vasily Leontiev agenda of the early 1950s about how to think about technical change in different sorts of economies, and the effort to have a dynamic input-output model on which, I mean, Robert Solow was Leontiev's research assistant trying to figure out a dynamic IO model. That was this, I came very late into this as a sort of research assistant myself. I think the problem for historians in working with actual input-output data for, say, the early 20th century has to do with the critique of sources. And this is something which I also think is super interesting and important for both economists and historians, namely to really think more systematically about where the statistical data come from. And to the extent that history PhD students have been engaged in the economic history seminars, it's actually been really constructive, because I think both sides improve their work by thinking more about where statistics come from and the circumstance that they don't actually sort of grow on websites.
Thanks. So I've got the first question here is from Mohib Ali. How does one evaluate the use of categories such as S services in Clems as opposed to unproductive labor in Smith and other classical economists for macro history? So the distinction between services and unproductive labor. And I think it's a great question. It reminds me of this David Graeber book on bullshit jobs. Is that the modern version of unproductive labor?
Yeah, I mean, it's a absolutely central question, which I try to address a bit towards the end of the paper, but not really in a satisfactory way. I mean, I think what I wanted to do was to use the conventional framework as a kind of demonstration, but I think that if I were actually about to start off on a major economic history project myself, and if it were me, it probably wouldn't be about this period. I would start by taking all forms of labor and really coming to terms with the fact that such a large proportion of the population of these sort of rapidly changing industrial revolution societies were in fact working very remote from the occupations in which ingenuity was being applied. So, and this is true, of course, of female unremunerated labor, although I think that's a slightly smaller part of the problem than it would be in the later 19th century, because there were many millions of women who were working in remunerated occupations. It's actually something that Adam Smith himself addresses in relation to female textile workers who go in and out of the recorded labor market according to times of high and low prices. I mean, I think the Smith's own distinction between productive and unproductive labor doesn't actually map onto the remunerated or unremunerated distinction very well, in that many of the people who he considered to be unproductive were very highly paid. But I think of Joachim Vogt's early work based on witnesses in criminal cases. What were you doing at a particular time? I mean, there are ways of getting at a large expanse of labor activities, and I think there are wonderful possibilities there. And again, one has to approach the question with quite a bit of skepticism about contemporary measurements, which to some extent Lee Shaw Taylor and others at the Cambridge group are beginning to do. I mean, I think another area that's super interesting has to do with employment in the incipient retail industries, which in the 18th century, in the Jan de Vries narrative, buying things was an extremely important part of fundamental change, and there were expanding retail activities, many of them involving women. There have been extraordinary recent studies, not so much in English, about the 18th century construction industry, which in some countries also involved women. And construction, because it's seasonal, poses all sorts of problems for in any period for enumeration, but really to start thinking about these kinds of labor in relation to economic transformation seems to me super important. So thank you.
Thanks. So the next on my list is our host, Ria Stavis. So Ria, would you like to ask your question live?
Thank you very much. Thanks, Emma, for an excellent presentation and exciting to-do list. But since you say that you want to focus on your ambition, let me query you a little bit on the scale. For good or bad, macro statistics has focused on this calculation of net value added aggregated across sectors that we call GDP. And you mentioned in passing that you have little hope that we'll be able to move to an input-output matrix of the past, or a dynamic one. But what's the alternative? So is it really possible to deliver on this program that you outlined without actually doing that, right? Without actually calculating the full input-output matrix? And if so, at what disaggregation and to what effect? That's my first observation. The second, so if we were to do that, right? If we were to try to understand how different levels of production resulted from combination of different and sometimes completely new inputs and so on, how would this relate to the already very well established literature on the history of technology? Because in the end, even finance, right? We can consider it as an accumulation of different technological solutions for perennial problems. So how would you see the relation between, dare I say, call it traditional history of technology and this new research program? Thank you very much.
Well, on the input-output, Jane Humphreys and Martin Wheel and others made an absolutely valiant attempt at an input-output estimates for the early 19th century British economy. I am skeptical about whether it would be worth the effort to put together industry by industry statistics on that basis. What I'm really asking for something very different, when here I am very directly inspired by the sort of by the new microeconomics of development. I mean, basically what Banerjee and Duflo have done over quite a few years is put together amazing case studies that are together extremely compelling. And I mean that there are people who've worked with Banerjee, like Rick Hornbeck, who've done something similarly sort of pointillist in using natural experiments in relation to economic history. I think what I would like to see is there to be much more of that sort of, in a way, opportunistic work, opportunistic in relation to finding sources, not in relation to the theory or the ideas, and then for maybe you to think about what it all adds up to. So it's a quite different way of aggregating from starting with trying to do input-output, and it's also, I think, it requires a tolerance for incompleteness that has not been, was not evident in the sort of great growth accounting successes of the 1970s and 1980s. The history of technology point is really fascinating. I mean, I think a lot of what I would like to see is being done by in history of technology departments, and in two respects. I mean, historians of science and technology are getting much more interested in the sort of business of technology on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think that historians of science are getting much more interested in the history of economic thought. There's a very specific point which has to do with the attention paid to mechanical industries versus textile industries. I think that the history of organic chemicals used in the textile industry, and the transition slightly later to inorganic chemicals, which is, in large part the history of potash and alum, is a fascinating subject, one that is still understudied, and in part this reflects the continuing dominance of the English paradigm in thinking about the Industrial Revolution rather than the French paradigm, where French technological success was sort of strikingly located in the early chemical industry and in textiles. On finance, something similar. I mean, I think these were new technologies that were embedded in purchases of financial services. And one of the things I say in the paper that's relevant to this and relevant to a future historian of financial technology, they were intensively productive of pieces of paper, even when people were trying to conceal what they were doing. And there's a political economy of what was going on, in the sense that there were a lot of private bills that were required. There were a lot of regulations that were required. I mean, I talk about actual legislation about mortgages in the West Indies. And just to come back to the paper I mentioned, the recent paper by Cormac O'Grada and others, I mean, that is in some ways a history of technology in relation both to marine insurance and to copper sheathing and things. So I think this is just super promising.
So thanks. There are two questions that I see, and then finally I saw somebody raise their hand. So maybe I could take the two questions together, because they are in a way related, and in some ways they develop out of the big question that Regis posed. Paul Rode asked, how does the vertical integration of firms affect the calculation of gross output? Focusing on value added takes inputs out of the measure of an industry's production. So it's a kind of fundamental point about the changing structure of enterprise and about the story of the firm. And Warren Oliver puts a slightly different twist on this. What is current thinking about the aggregation of capital? The post-war two Cambridges debate seems to have fizzled out, with the OECD and national statistical agencies happy to produce aggregate measures of capital, and users of these estimates trying not to think about aggregation difficulties. So maybe you could have a try at those. And then just at the end, I think Mario, I'm sorry, that's the only identification I saw, wanted to raise a hand. So maybe we could permit that to happen just before the hour.
Well, yeah, I mean, the vertical integration point is absolutely central, and part of what's been happening with the apparent sharp increase in intermediate inputs of financial and other services in the US economy over the last 10 or so years has precisely to do with outsourcing of financial service functions that were previously performed within large vertically integrated firms. So, or large integrated firms. So this would be something to disentangle in relation particularly to the sort of hypothesis I'm putting forward that inputs of financial and insurance services are understudied in relation specifically to the the Industrial Revolution. But I do more generally have a quite a lot of sympathy with the sort of gross output view that we should just look at the whole economy in a sort of almost in a flat way. We should think about what businesses are actually doing, about all these transactions that are going on, rather than worrying too much about deriving value added. And I'm aware that there's a sort of small group of economists and others who are kind of real devotees of gross output. And there was even something called GO Day, I think, last year, when the US Department of Commerce started publishing regular gross output series. I think I'm really trying to say something relatively modest, namely this is something for economic historians to think about more seriously. The point about a current thinking about aggregation is super interesting, and I do talk about this in the paper, because on the one hand, I think that the measurement of the kind of improvements in the measurement of capital, where it has become possible, and this goes back to Jorgensen's work and Grillekes's work, it's become possible to have really very precise estimates of flows of capital services. I mean, that's had a sort of effect of, in a way, flattening the idea of capital on the one hand, and on the other hand, the idea of capital is being stretched almost to breaking point in current national account systems of different countries, as more and more invisible forms of property are included in in aggregate capital. So I'm personally very skeptical about these metaphors of natural capital that are sometimes, or natural or environmental capital that are sometimes being promoted. But in general, I think there are two complementary processes going on, which have the effect that the idea of capital is much more sort of modest than it was when Solow and Temin were writing about the British Industrial Revolution. And again, I think I'm saying something rather tentative, which is, why don't we think about this elusiveness of capital a bit more in relation to historical periods? And I go back to what Harold said. I mean, I think this is absolutely relevant to several historical periods other than the classic Industrial Revolution.
Well, thank you so much, Emma. That was really just great. A wonderful paper and a terrific presentation. I see from the Q&A that the Mario question was already answered, and it is indeed absolutely on the hour, so we should stop here the formal part of our discussion. And it's a great pleasure to say that next week this seminar returns to Princeton with my colleague from the politics department, Melissa Lee, talking about historical determinants of state power. So that's for 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, 5 p.m. in continental Europe next week. But we have another 15 minutes now of more informal and less structured discussion. So please stay on for that. And somebody asked, is there a possibility for the organizers to share the paper? Yes, there is. It's actually on the website already, and you can click on the link on the website for the seminar schedule to download the paper.
Well, I hope, alas, I think it's Project Muse, so I hope it doesn't go to a paywall. I'm not sure. It may go to a university paywall. The Capitalism or the University of Pennsylvania Press has varying attitudes to this.
It looks to me as if it's available without a pay line, but in a less attractive type. So it's got a kind of unattractive type in the way that it's downloaded that differs from the original format in the journal. But we've got now Ibrahim Adamuya raised a hand. So could we maybe get Ibrahim to come into the discussion? Yep, I see you there. Ibrahim, please. Maybe there's a technology issue. So can I ask you to wait a moment? And Nathan had a question that I think Nathan is ready to ask.
Oh, thank you, Emma, for the very interesting presentation. I mean, I would like to follow on some of these questions and maybe ask in terms of students, potential students of economic history that are reading this paper, PhD students or students in general, and I would like to, if you could clarify a little bit the kind of the message to this audience. Is it that we want to do the gross output or disaggregated analysis of the economy, as I think most economic historians have done throughout their research, which is, I mean, very few of us as economic historians go to the aggregate macro type of OECD approaches, and most of us are engaged in sort of micro level studies. And is your sort of recommendation first to somehow to aggregate these studies, or what's the purpose? Is the purpose that we should do all these micro level studies so that we can aggregate them to this concept of gross output, or is that just or the concept of gross output is justification for this kind of economic history that we're doing already? I mean, it's kind of what's in terms of determining the purpose. And what would you advise, students, PhD students, etc., in that respect?
I encourage PhD students to do what they're doing, to do micro studies. I think I'm particularly encouraging micro studies of materials industries, intermediate goods industries, and to some extent of the sort of business of financial services. Now, there are wonderful PhD students who are doing this already. There's amazing recent work, for example, on marine insurance in relation to France that PhD students are doing right now. So I see the process of aggregation as being really something like the following, that 5 students who are all working on different raw materials industries write papers, meet by Zoom or meet over a workshop and try to figure out what it means for large and macro questions. So I suppose at some level, my exhortation is to take this micro work very seriously as something that can be really transformative in relation to understanding extremely important questions. I mean, clearly, I was influenced in writing this paper and in going back to the topic of the Industrial Revolution, which is something I've, in a sense, avoided all my life while working broadly in that period, by contemporary debates and by the setting of of public discussion of the Industrial Revolution in the 2020s. And I think here about an absolutely classic paper by Harold's colleague David Cannadine from 1984 called The Past and Present in the Industrial Revolution, about the different ways historians think about the Industrial Revolution in light of their own times. And the Industrial Revolution now, far more even than 20 years ago, is widely considered to be the sort of at the origin of catastrophe and cataclysm. On the one hand, the beginning of climate change. On the other hand, profoundly associated with colonial empire and slavery. So, well, one can put to one side what I call in the paper the sort of Industrial Revolution kitsch of the supporters of Brexit in the United Kingdom, where it's going to be the inspiration of a new economic resurgence. But I think young economic historians are going to be drawn to working on topics that possibly are illuminating for these huge reevaluations of the economic past. And I think that these sort of micro investigations are a way of sort of starting to do that. So I'm optimistic that by doing what so many students are now doing, there can be a real transformation in thinking about this part of the past. I mean, I'm aware that to the extent that I was arguing against economic historians, which I tried not particularly to do in the paper, they were economic historians of a much older generation. I don't think that a lot of those assumptions are entirely gone. So my sort of conclusion would be encouragement.
So I see Ibrahim has unmuted. So Ibrahim, would you like to ask the question? Hello. Maybe we're coming across the limits of Zoom at the moment. So
Ibrahim, email me and I'll try to answer the question if it.
So any other hands up? Well, this was a really fascinating session, and we are indeed actually really at the time now. So I think probably the best solution is indeed for Ibrahim to send an email to Professor Rothschild. So thank you very much, and looking forward again to the next session with Melissa Lee. And see you all in a week's time. Thank you, Rui. Thank you, Nathan, for doing all of this.
Thanks. Thank you very much for having. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Harold, for moderating.
Thank you. Bye. See you soon. Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.